Question 1. An environmental auditor is reviewing the procedures of a manufacturing facility that historically used solvents containing chlorinated hydrocarbons. The auditor needs to assess the effectiveness of the facility's environmental management system in addressing potential soil and groundwater contamination. Which of the following actions by the auditor would be most indicative of a thorough evaluation of the extent of contamination, in line with ISO 14011, 1996 guidelines for audit procedures? Option A. Interviewing the plant manager to confirm that the company is aware of potential contamination issues and has a general commitment to environmental compliance without requesting specific technical data or investigative reports. Option B. Examining the number of environmental training sessions conducted for operational staff on general waste segregation, irrespective of whether these sessions address specific risks related to historical solvent use or potential contamination pathways. Option C. Verifying that the facility has a publicly available environmental policy that mentions minimizing pollution without specific targets for contaminant reduction or remediation activities. Option D. Reviewing the facility's historical site usage records and comparing the types of solvents used with known persistence and mobility characteristics in local soil and hydrogeological conditions, while also examining the auditee's procedures for conducting site investigations and their adherence to relevant national environmental protection regulations concerning soil and groundwater quality. Correct answer is D. Reviewing the facility's historical site usage records and comparing the types of solvents used with known persistence and mobility characteristics in local soil and hydrogeological conditions, while also examining the auditee's procedures for conducting site investigations and their adherence to relevant national environmental protection regulations concerning soil and groundwater quality. Explanation: ISO 14011, 1996, specifically in the context of environmental auditing procedures, emphasizes a systematic approach to evaluating the extent of contamination. When assessing potential contamination, auditors must consider various factors to determine the scope and depth of the investigation. This involves understanding the nature of the potential contaminant, its likely pathways of migration, e.g., groundwater, soil, air, and the potential receptors, e.g., human health ecological systems. The audit process should involve reviewing historical site usage, geological and hydrological data, and any existing environmental monitoring results. The auditor's role is to assess whether the auditee has adequately identified and characterized potential contamination issues, and whether their management system is designed to control and mitigate these risks. This includes verifying that the auditee's procedures for site investigation and remediation, if applicable, align with relevant national or regional environmental regulations, such as those governing hazardous waste management or water quality standards. The evaluation of contamination extent is not a singular measurement, but a process of gathering and analyzing evidence to determine if the environmental management system effectively addresses potential environmental impacts arising from contamination. This requires an understanding of sampling strategies, analytical methods, and the interpretation of results in the context of regulatory limits and the organization's environmental policy. The auditor must be able to discern whether the auditee's approach to contamination assessment is comprehensive, scientifically sound, and compliant with applicable legal and other requirements. Question 2. Following an environmental audit that revealed a significant nonconformity regarding the improper segregation of hazardous waste, leading to potential violations of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) regulations, the auditee implemented corrective actions. What is the primary objective of the follow-up verification process as outlined in ISO 14011, 1996 for this specific scenario? Option A. To provide a final audit report that includes recommendations for future waste management practices, irrespective of the effectiveness of the immediate corrective actions. Option B. To assess the overall efficiency of the auditee's waste management system, including aspects beyond the initial nonconformity, to identify further areas for improvement. Option C. To document the auditee's commitment to environmental compliance by simply reviewing the updated waste segregation procedures and training records. Option D. To confirm that the implemented corrective actions have effectively addressed the root cause of the hazardous waste segregation issue and are preventing recurrence. thereby ensuring compliance with RCRA. The correct answer is D. To confirm that the implemented corrective actions have effectively addressed the root cause of the hazardous waste segregation issue and are preventing recurrence, thereby ensuring compliance with RCRA. Explanation: ISO 14011, 1996, specifically addressing audit procedures, emphasizes the crucial role of follow-up actions after an environmental audit. When an audit identifies nonconformities, corrective actions are required. The standard mandates that the audit team, or a designated representative, verify the implementation and effectiveness of these corrective actions. This verification process is not merely a check of whether a document was filed or a procedure was updated, but a deeper assessment to ensure the root cause of the nonconformity has been addressed and that the corrective action has indeed rectified the issue and prevented recurrence. This often involves re-examining the audited area, reviewing records, and potentially interviewing personnel to confirm the changes are embedded in practice and are achieving the desired environmental improvement. The objective is to confirm that the management system is functioning as intended to control environmental aspects and impacts. The follow-up audit scope is typically focused on the specific nonconformities and the corrective actions taken, ensuring they align with the organization's environmental policy and objectives and comply with relevant environmental legislation, such as the Clean Water Act or RCRA regulations, if applicable to the audited entity. The verification ensures the audit process has led to tangible improvements in environmental performance and compliance. Question 3. When preparing for an environmental audit of a chemical processing plant located in a region with stringent water quality regulations, which combination of elements would constitute the most comprehensive and legally sound set of audit criteria according to the principles outlined in ISO 14011, 1996? Option A. The company's historical environmental incident reports, competitor analysis of environmental performance, and the company's marketing materials promoting eco-friendly products. Option B. The company's recent sustainability report, customer feedback on environmental performance, and the company's emergency response plan for chemical spills. Option C. The company's employee training records on environmental awareness, industry-specific best practice guidelines from a trade association, and the company's mission statement regarding sustainability. Option D. The company's internal environmental policy, the specific effluent discharge permit issued by the Regional Environmental Protection Agency, and the National Environmental Protection Act governing industrial waste. The correct answer is D. The company's internal environmental policy, the specific effluent discharge permit issued by the Regional Environmental Protection Agency, and the National Environmental Protection Act governing industrial waste. Explanation: the selection of audit criteria is a fundamental step in conducting an environmental audit according to ISO 14011, 1996. Audit criteria are the set of policies, procedures, or requirements against which audit evidence is compared. For an organization operating in a regulated industry, such as chemical manufacturing, the identified audit criteria must encompass all relevant legal and regulatory obligations that pertain to its environmental performance. This includes, but is not limited to, National Environmental Protection Acts, specific pollutant discharge limits set by environmental agencies, e.g., Clean Water Act effluent standards, permits issued for air emissions or waste disposal, and any international agreements or conventions that the country has ratified and that are applicable to the organization's operations. Furthermore, the organization's own internal environmental policies, management system standards, like ISO 14001. Although ISO 14011, 1996 predates the widely adopted 2015 version, the principle of internal policies as criteria remains, and specific contractual obligations related to environmental performance also form crucial parts of the audit criteria. Therefore, a comprehensive list would include the company's environmental policy, specific operating permits for emissions and waste, national environmental legislation, and any relevant industry best practices that the organization has committed to. The inclusion of voluntary industry standards or customer-specific environmental requirements, while important for a holistic assessment, are secondary to the mandatory legal and permit-based criteria when ensuring compliance. Question 4. When conducting an environmental audit of a medium-sized printing facility that utilizes various inks and solvents and is subject to local air quality regulations and national hazardous waste disposal mandates, what is the most comprehensive approach for an auditor to identify potential environmental risks and hazards related to chemical handling and waste generation, beyond simply reviewing current inventory logs and waste manifests? Option A. Analyze the entire chemical life cycle, from procurement and storage through usage in printing processes and final disposal of waste streams, considering potential fugitive emissions, accidental spills, and the efficacy of containment and treatment systems, while also evaluating historical incident reports and employee training records. Option B. Conduct a visual inspection of all chemical storage areas and waste accumulation points, noting any visible leaks or improper labeling, and interview the environmental compliance officer regarding their daily operational procedures. Option C. Review the company's environmental policy statement and its stated commitment to pollution prevention, assuming that adherence to this policy will inherently address all potential risks and hazards in chemical handling and waste generation. Option D. Primarily focus on verifying compliance with the most recent local air quality permits and national hazardous waste regulations by cross-referencing the facility's reported emissions and waste quantities against legal limits and disposal procedures. The correct answer is A. Analyze the entire chemical life cycle, from procurement and storage through usage in printing processes and final disposal of waste streams, considering potential fugitive emissions, accidental spills, and the efficacy of containment and treatment systems, while also evaluating historical incident reports and employee training records. Explanation: the core of identifying potential environmental risks and hazards during an audit, as guided by ISO 14011-1996, involves a systematic approach that goes beyond mere observation of current operations. It necessitates understanding the entire life cycle of processes and products, including inputs, activities, outputs, and potential byproducts. This involves looking for conditions that could lead to environmental harm, such as inadequate containment of hazardous substances, potential for uncontrolled releases, or inefficient resource utilization. The auditor must consider both routine and non-routine activities, as well as foreseeable emergency situations. For instance, during the audit of a chemical manufacturing plant, an auditor would not only examine the storage of raw materials, but also consider the potential for fugitive emissions from piping, the safe disposal of waste streams, and the emergency response plan in case of a spill. The identification of hazards also includes evaluating the effectiveness of existing controls and determining if they are sufficient to mitigate identified risks. This proactive stance is crucial for preventing noncompliance with environmental legislation, such as the Clean Air Act or the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) in the United States, or similar regulations in other jurisdictions. The auditor's role is to anticipate potential failures and deviations from intended environmental performance, thereby providing recommendations for improvement before an incident occurs. This involves a thorough review of documentation, interviews with personnel at various levels, and direct observation of site conditions. The focus is on identifying the root causes of potential problems, not just the symptoms. Question 5. When evaluating the depth of environmental management system integration within a manufacturing firm's core business operations, as per ISO 14011-1996 guidelines, which of the following audit findings would most strongly indicate a mature and effective integration? Option A. Regular training sessions on environmental compliance are conducted for all employees, with attendance records meticulously maintained. Option B. An independent environmental consultant has reviewed the EMS annually, providing a report on its adherence to regulatory requirements. Option C. Environmental performance indicators are consistently tracked and reported alongside key financial and operational metrics, influencing strategic resource allocation and product lifecycle management decisions. Option D. The organization has a comprehensive set of environmental procedures, documented and readily available for all relevant personnel. The correct answer is C. Environmental performance indicators are consistently tracked and reported alongside key financial and operational metrics, influencing strategic resource allocation and product lifecycle management decisions. Explanation: the core of integrating an environmental management system, M's into business operations, as guided by ISO 14011, 1996, lies in ensuring that environmental considerations are not an add-on, but are embedded within the organization's strategic planning, decision-making processes, and daily activities. This involves a thorough review of how environmental aspects and impacts are identified, assessed, and managed across various functions. For an auditor, evaluating this integration requires looking beyond simple compliance with documented procedures. It necessitates examining the extent to which environmental policy objectives are translated into actionable departmental goals. The presence of environmental performance indicators that are tracked and reported alongside financial or operational metrics, and the degree to which employees at all levels understand their roles in achieving environmental commitments. A key indicator of successful integration is the proactive identification and mitigation of environmental risks as part of broader business risk assessments, rather than treating them as separate compliance issues. Furthermore, the audit should assess if environmental considerations influence resource allocation, product development, and supplier selection processes. The alignment of environmental performance with overall business strategy demonstrates a mature integration, where environmental management contributes to organizational efficiency, innovation, and long-term sustainability, thereby supporting the principles of effective environmental auditing as outlined in the standard. Question 6. When evaluating a potential acquisition of a manufacturing plant, the acquiring company's primary concern is to ascertain the extent of historical soil and groundwater contamination and the associated remediation costs, alongside verifying the facility's adherence to local discharge permits under the Clean Water Act. Which type of environmental audit is most appropriate for this specific objective? Option A, environmental compliance audit. Option B, environmental performance audit. Option C, environmental due diligence audit. Option D, environmental management system audit. The correct answer is C, environmental due diligence audit. Explanation. The scenario describes a situation where an organization is acquiring a new facility. The primary goal is to understand the potential environmental liabilities associated with this acquisition, particularly concerning past contamination and compliance with current regulations like the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act (CERCLA) in the United States, or similar national/regional legislation governing hazardous substances and site remediation. An environmental audit focused on identifying and assessing these historical and potential future liabilities, as well as evaluating the current state of environmental management practices at the target facility, is crucial. This type of audit aims to provide the acquiring entity with the information necessary to make an informed decision about the acquisition, including potential costs for cleanup or remediation, and to establish a basis for negotiating the purchase price or seeking indemnification. This aligns with the principles of environmental due diligence, which is a proactive process to identify and assess environmental risks before committing to a transaction. While compliance audits ensure adherence to specific regulations and management system audits verify the effectiveness of an organization's environmental management system, EMS. The core objective in an acquisition context is to uncover and quantify environmental risks and obligations. Therefore, an audit designed to inform an acquisition decision, focusing on historical contamination, regulatory compliance status, and potential future liabilities, is best characterized as a due diligence audit. Question 7. Consider an environmental audit conducted under the framework of ISO 14011, 1996, where the audit team discovers evidence of a minor, non-compliant discharge of wastewater into a local river, which is below the threshold requiring mandatory reporting to the Environmental Protection Agency as per the Clean Water Act. The auditee's management requests that this specific finding not be included in the final audit report shared with external stakeholders, citing potential reputational damage and the fact that it is not a reportable offense under current legislation. What is the most appropriate course of action for the audit team? Adhering strictly to the principles of ISO 14011, 1996 regarding the confidentiality and reporting of audit findings. Option A. The audit team should comply with the auditee's request and omit the finding from the report to protect the auditee's reputation, as the discharge is not legally reportable. Option B. The audit team should escalate the issue to the Environmental Protection Agency immediately, even though it's below the reporting threshold, to ensure full transparency. Option C. The audit team must document the finding accurately in the audit report, regardless of its severity or reporting threshold, and ensure the report is shared only with authorized individuals as per the agreed distribution list, maintaining confidentiality while fulfilling audit integrity. Option D. The audit team should agree to exclude the finding from the formal report, but provide a separate, informal verbal notification to the auditee's senior management about the non-compliance. The correct answer is C. The audit team must document the finding accurately in the audit report, regardless of its severity or reporting threshold, and ensure the report is shared only with authorized individuals as per the agreed distribution list, maintaining confidentiality while fulfilling audit integrity. Explanation: ISO 14011, 1996, in its guidelines for environmental auditing, emphasizes the critical importance of maintaining the confidentiality of audit information. This principle is fundamental to fostering trust between the auditee and the audit team, and for ensuring that sensitive business or operational data, which might be uncovered during the audit process, is not disclosed inappropriately. The standard posits that audit findings, reports, and related documentation should only be shared with authorized personnel within the auditee organization and the client organization commissioning the audit, unless there is a legal or regulatory requirement for disclosure. Unauthorized dissemination could lead to competitive disadvantages for the auditee, damage to reputation, or even legal repercussions if proprietary information is leaked. Therefore, audit teams must implement robust procedures for handling, storing, and transmitting audit-related information to prevent breaches of confidentiality. This includes secure document management, password protection for digital files, and clear protocols for communication about audit outcomes. The goal is to ensure that the integrity of the audit process and the trust placed in the auditors are upheld, thereby facilitating a more open and effective audit. Question 8. An environmental auditor is evaluating the effectiveness of a chemical manufacturing company's controls designed to prevent accidental releases of hazardous substances into a nearby river, a scenario governed by regulations like the Clean Water Act. The company has documented procedures for secondary containment, leak detection, and emergency response. During the audit, the auditor reviews these documents and observes the physical infrastructure. What is the most critical factor for the auditor to ascertain regarding these controls to determine their effectiveness in accordance with ISO 14011, 1996 guidelines? Option A. Demonstrable evidence that the controls are consistently operating as intended and achieving their risk mitigation objectives, supported by performance monitoring and incident records. Option B. Completeness and clarity of the written procedures, ensuring they are readily accessible to all relevant personnel, even if actual implementation has not been rigorously verified. Option C. The frequency of internal audits conducted on the environmental management system, assuming that regular internal reviews automatically validate the efficacy of all implemented risk controls. Option D. The extent to which the documented procedures for secondary containment, leak detection, and emergency response align with the most recent revisions of industry best practices, irrespective of actual performance. The correct answer is A. Demonstrable evidence that the controls are consistently operating as intended and achieving their risk mitigation objectives, supported by performance monitoring and incident records. Explanation: ISO 14011, 1996, in its guidance on environmental auditing, emphasizes the auditor's role in evaluating the effectiveness of an organization's environmental management system, EMS, and its controls. When assessing the effectiveness of risk management controls related to potential environmental impacts, an auditor must go beyond merely verifying the existence of documented procedures. The core of the assessment lies in determining whether these controls are actually preventing or mitigating the identified environmental risks as intended. This involves examining evidence of control operation, performance data, and the outcomes achieved. For instance, if a control is designed to limit fugitive emissions from a storage tank, the auditor would look for records of regular inspections, maintenance logs for seals, and monitoring data of actual emissions. A key aspect is the alignment of the control's implementation with the specific risks it is meant to address, considering the relevant regulatory framework, such as the Clean Air Act or local discharge permits. The auditor also considers the responsiveness of the controls to changing conditions or new information about risks. Therefore, the most critical element is not just the documented procedure itself, but the demonstrable evidence that the control is functioning as designed and achieving its intended environmental protection objective. Question 9. When documenting an environmental audit finding in accordance with ISO 14011-1996, what is the most critical element to ensure the auditee can effectively implement corrective actions? Option A. A summary of all potential environmental risks identified during the audit, irrespective of their direct link to EMS nonconformities. Option B. An opinion from the lead auditor regarding the auditee's overall environmental performance, without specific details of noncompliance. Option C. A general statement of the area of concern within the EMS, followed by a recommendation for a broad category of improvement. Option D. A precise reference to the specific EMS requirement or legal obligation that was not met, coupled with the direct, observable evidence demonstrating the deviation. Correct answer is D. A precise reference to the specific EMS requirement or legal obligation that was not met, coupled with the direct, observable evidence demonstrating the deviation. Explanation. The core principle of documenting audit findings and observations under ISO 14011-1996 is to ensure clarity, accuracy, and actionability. Audit findings are factual statements about the conformance or nonconformance of an auditee's environmental management system, EMS, with audit criteria. Observations, on the other hand, are statements of fact that, while not constituting a nonconformance, could indicate a potential for future nonconformance or an opportunity for improvement. When documenting these, the emphasis is on providing sufficient detail to enable the auditee to understand the issue and take appropriate corrective action. This includes specifying the relevant requirement, e.g., a clause from the EMS standard or a legal obligation, the evidence observed, and the implication of the finding or observation. The process of documenting should be objective and impartial, focusing on the evidence gathered during the audit. The final report consolidates these documented findings and observations, presenting them in a structured manner that facilitates review and decision-making by the auditee's management. The goal is to provide a clear roadmap for improvement and to demonstrate the effectiveness of the EMS. This aligns with the general principles of auditing, which stress evidence-based conclusions and professional skepticism. Question 10. An environmental auditor is assessing an organization's compliance with its hazardous waste management program, which is governed by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) regulations. The auditor plans to gather evidence regarding the proper labeling and storage of hazardous waste containers, which combination of evidence-gathering techniques, when used in conjunction, would most effectively triangulate findings related to container management, ensuring reliability and sufficiency of the evidence. Option A. Interviewing maintenance staff about their understanding of waste disposal procedures, reviewing the organization's environmental policy document, and observing general housekeeping practices in non-waste-related areas. Option B. Observing the operation of the wastewater treatment plant, interviewing the facility's legal counsel regarding potential environmental liabilities, and reviewing the organization's utility bills. Option C. Observing the physical condition and labeling of waste containers in the accumulation area, interviewing the site environmental manager about the waste tracking procedures, and reviewing hazardous waste manifests and internal inspection records. Option D. Reviewing the organization's environmental training records for all employees, conducting a walkthrough of the administrative offices, and examining the company's marketing materials related to its environmental initiatives. The correct answer is C. Observing the physical condition and labeling of waste containers in the accumulation area, interviewing the site environmental manager about the waste tracking procedures, and reviewing hazardous waste manifests and internal inspection records. Explanation. The process of gathering evidence during an environmental audit, as outlined in ISO 14011-1996, involves a systematic approach to collect information that is relevant, reliable, and sufficient to support audit findings. Observation, interviews, and document review are the primary methods for evidence collection. Observation allows auditors to witness activities and conditions firsthand, such as the operation of pollution control equipment or waste handling practices. Interviews provide insights into the understanding and implementation of environmental procedures by personnel at various levels, offering perspectives on how policies are put into practice and identifying potential gaps. Document review involves examining records like permits, monitoring data, training logs, and internal audit reports to verify compliance with legal requirements and the organization's environmental management system. The effectiveness of these methods is enhanced by the auditor's ability to corroborate information obtained from one source with evidence from another, a principle known as evidence triangulation. This ensures that conclusions are well-founded and objective. For instance, observing a process and then interviewing the operator about that process, followed by reviewing the relevant operational logbook, provides a more robust basis for an audit finding than relying on any single method alone. The selection and application of these methods are guided by the audit objectives, scope, and the specific environmental aspects being examined, such as compliance with the Clean Air Act or adherence to internal waste segregation protocols. Question 11. Consider a scenario where an environmental audit is being conducted at a manufacturing facility to assess compliance with local emissions regulations and the facility's own environmental management system. The audit team consists of a lead auditor, 2 auditors, and a technical specialist. During the audit, one of the auditors identifies a potential nonconformity related to waste disposal, but the technical specialist suggests it might be an acceptable deviation based on an interpretation of a specific clause in the facility's permit, which differs from the auditor's initial understanding. Which of the following best describes the lead auditor's responsibility in resolving this discrepancy to ensure the audit proceeds according to ISO 14011/1996 guidelines? Option A. The lead auditor should direct the technical specialist to independently finalize the interpretation of the permit clause, and the audit team should proceed based on that specialist's conclusion without further discussion. Option B. The lead auditor must review the conflicting interpretations of the permit clause, consult with the technical specialist and the auditor, and make a final determination on the classification of the finding, potentially requiring further evidence gathering or clarification from the auditee. Option C. The lead auditor should immediately escalate the issue to the regulatory body that issued the permit for an official interpretation before proceeding with any further assessment of the waste disposal practices. Option D. The lead auditor should instruct the auditor to document the potential nonconformity as observed and defer the final classification to the auditee's environmental manager for their internal review. Correct answer is B. The lead auditor must review the conflicting interpretations of the permit clause, consult with the technical specialist and the auditor, and make a final determination on the classification of the finding, potentially requiring further evidence gathering or clarification from the auditee. Explanation. The lead auditor's primary responsibility is to ensure the audit is conducted in accordance with the audit plan and relevant standards, including ISO 14011/1996. This involves managing the audit team, assigning tasks, communicating with the auditee management, and overseeing the collection and review of audit evidence. The lead auditor is accountable for the overall audit process and the final audit report, while auditors are responsible for gathering evidence and reporting findings, and the auditee is responsible for providing access and information. The lead auditor holds the ultimate responsibility for the integrity and execution of the audit. This includes ensuring the audit team's competence, maintaining objectivity, and making final decisions regarding audit findings and conclusions. The lead auditor's role is crucial in navigating potential conflicts, ensuring consistent application of audit criteria, and facilitating effective communication throughout the audit engagement. Their oversight is paramount to the successful completion of an environmental audit according to established procedures. Question 12. Consider a scenario where an environmental auditing team is preparing to assess a manufacturing facility that produces specialized alloys. The facility has a history of minor, localized solvent spills from a particular process line, which are typically cleaned up promptly with minimal regulatory interaction. However, recent analyses indicate a potential, albeit unconfirmed, for a significant long-term groundwater contamination event stemming from an older, less monitored waste disposal area, which could trigger substantial remediation costs and severe legal penalties under regulations like the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA). In applying the principles of risk assessment and materiality, as outlined in ISO 14011, 1996, which environmental aspects should the audit team prioritize for in-depth investigation during their audit planning? Option A. The potential for a significant, long-term groundwater contamination event due to the older waste disposal area. Option B. The disposal methods for general office waste, such as paper and plastics. Option C. The energy consumption patterns of the facility's administrative offices. Option D. The frequent minor solvent spills from the specialized alloy production line. The correct answer is A. The potential for a significant long-term groundwater contamination event due to the older waste disposal area. Explanation. The core principle of risk assessment in environmental auditing, as guided by ISO 14011, 1996, is to identify and evaluate potential environmental aspects and their associated impacts. Materiality in this context refers to the significance of these aspects and impacts in relation to the overall environmental performance and the objectives of the audit. When an organization is undergoing an audit, the auditor must determine which environmental issues are substantial enough to warrant focused attention. This determination is not solely based on the frequency of an event, but also on its potential consequence and the likelihood of its occurrence. For instance, a minor spill that occurs frequently might be less material than a single, large spill with significant regulatory implications and potential for widespread ecological damage. The auditor's judgment, informed by the organization's environmental policy, objectives, legal requirements such as the Clean Water Act or local emission standards, and the potential for nonconformities, guides the identification of material aspects. The process involves considering the magnitude, severity, and probability of potential environmental harm or noncompliance. Therefore, the focus is on those elements that could lead to significant environmental impacts or breaches of regulatory compliance, irrespective of whether they are frequent or infrequent. Question 13. Following an audit that identified a nonconformity regarding a company's failure to adequately control emissions from a specific process, leading to potential exceedances of local air quality standards, the auditee implemented a corrective action involving the installation of a new filtration system. What is the most appropriate method for the environmental auditor to employ to evaluate the effectiveness of this corrective action, considering the principles of ISO 14011, 1996? Option A. Conducting a follow-up audit solely focused on the training provided to operators on the new filtration system, assuming this is the primary driver of effectiveness. Option B. Accepting the auditee's internal report stating the filtration system has resolved the emission issue without further independent verification. Option C. Interviewing the environmental manager to ascertain their confidence that the corrective action has been effective in preventing recurrence of the nonconformity. Option D. Reviewing process documentation and operational logs to confirm the new filtration system is installed and functioning as designed, and then comparing post-installation emission monitoring data against pre-installation data and applicable regulatory limits. The correct answer is D. Reviewing process documentation and operational logs to confirm the new filtration system is installed and functioning as designed, and then comparing post-installation emission monitoring data against pre-installation data and applicable regulatory limits. Explanation. Evaluating the effectiveness of corrective actions is a crucial step in the environmental auditing process as outlined in ISO 14011, 1996. The primary objective is to confirm that the implemented actions have indeed resolved the identified nonconformity and prevented its recurrence. This involves more than just verifying that an action was taken. It requires a thorough assessment of the action's impact on the environmental management system and the actual environmental performance. Auditors must gather objective evidence to support their conclusions. This evidence might include updated procedures, training records, monitoring data, or changes in operational practices. The evaluation should consider whether the corrective action has addressed the root cause of the nonconformity, not just the symptom. For instance, if a nonconformity relates to exceeding wastewater discharge limits, a corrective action might be to adjust a process parameter. However, The effectiveness evaluation would need to confirm that this adjustment consistently keeps the discharge within legal limits, such as those stipulated by the Clean Water Act or equivalent local regulations, and that the underlying reason for the parameter drift has been understood and managed. The audit should also look for any unintended negative consequences of the corrective action. Therefore, the most appropriate method for evaluating effectiveness is to compare the environmental performance data before and after the implementation of the corrective action, ensuring that the nonconformity is no longer occurring and that the system improvements are sustainable. Question 14. Consider a scenario where an environmental auditor, following the procedures outlined in ISO 14011, 1996, is conducting a site visit to a manufacturing facility. The audit plan includes a focus on the management of hazardous waste. During the inspection of the facility's chemical storage area, the auditor observes several drums of spent solvent that are not clearly labeled with their contents or hazard warnings, and some are showing signs of corrosion. The auditor also notes that the area is not adequately ventilated, contrary to the facility's documented environmental procedures, and potentially violating local environmental regulations concerning hazardous material storage. Based on these observations, what is the most appropriate initial action for the auditor in documenting this potential nonconformity? Option A. Immediately issue a formal citation to the facility manager for gross negligence in hazardous waste management and demand immediate cessation of operations in the affected area. Option B. Make a general note in their personal log about potential issues with waste storage and plan to follow up with the facility's environmental manager at a later date for clarification without specific documentation. Option C. Record a detailed description of the unlabeled and corroded drums, the lack of adequate ventilation, and reference the specific clauses of the environmental procedures and relevant regulations that appear to be contravened, noting the location and time of observation. Option D. Focus solely on the unlabeled drums, assuming the ventilation issue is a separate, minor concern that does not require immediate detailed recording during the site visit itself. The correct answer is C. Record a detailed description of the unlabeled and corroded drums, the lack of adequate ventilation, and reference the specific clauses of the environmental procedures and relevant regulations that appear to be contravened, noting the location and time of observation. Explanation. The process of conducting a site visit during an environmental audit, as guided by ISO 14011, 1996, involves a systematic approach to gather objective evidence. The audit team must be prepared, having reviewed the audit plan, relevant environmental legislation, such as the Clean Air Act or the Water Pollution Control Act, depending on the auditee's operations, and the organization's environmental management system documentation. During the site visit, the auditors observe operational activities, examine records, and interview personnel. The focus is on verifying the implementation and effectiveness of the environmental management system in practice. Specifically, when observing a process like waste handling, an auditor would look for adherence to documented procedures, proper segregation of waste streams, correct labeling of containers, and appropriate disposal methods. Evidence of noncompliance, such as improperly stored hazardous waste or emissions exceeding permitted levels, would be documented. The auditor's role is to gather sufficient appropriate evidence to support their findings, which are then reported in the audit conclusion. The selection of areas to visit and the depth of inspection are determined by the audit scope, objectives, and the identified risks associated with different operational areas. A critical aspect is to ensure that the observations are consistent with the information provided in the organization's environmental policy and objectives. Question 15. During an environmental audit of a manufacturing facility, the audit team discovers that the company's documented procedures for hazardous waste segregation and disposal are not being consistently followed, leading to potential noncompliance with the Hazardous Waste, England and Wales, Regulations 2005. This observation occurs during the implementation and operation phase of their environmental management system. What is the most critical immediate action the audit team must ensure is undertaken by the auditee to address this finding? Option A. Ensure the auditee initiates corrective actions to address the identified nonconformance and prevent recurrence. Option B. Document the nonconformance in detail for inclusion in the final audit report. Option C. Assess the potential environmental impact of the improper waste segregation and disposal practices. Option D. Recommend that the auditee inform top management about the observed procedural breakdown. The correct answer is A. Ensure the auditee initiates corrective actions to address the identified nonconformance and prevent recurrence. Explanation. The core principle of an environmental management system, EMS, audit, as outlined in ISO 14011, 1996, is to verify the effectiveness of the system in achieving environmental objectives and compliance with relevant legislation. When an audit team identifies a significant nonconformance during the implementation phase of an EMS, such as a failure to properly document waste disposal procedures in accordance with the Hazardous Waste, England and Wales Regulations 2005, the immediate and most critical action required by the auditor is to ensure that corrective actions are initiated by the auditee. This involves not just noting the issue, but actively pushing for the auditee to understand the root cause and develop and implement a plan to rectify the situation and prevent recurrence. While documenting the nonconformance for the audit report and assessing the impact on the overall EMS are essential steps, they are secondary to the immediate need for corrective action to address the breach of documented procedures and legal requirements. Informing higher management is also important, but the primary responsibility for initiating corrective action lies with the auditee's management responsible for the audited area. Therefore, the most crucial immediate step is to ensure the auditee starts the process of correction. Question 16. Consider a scenario where an environmental auditor, while reviewing a manufacturing facility's waste disposal records under ISO 14011, 1996 guidelines, inadvertently discovers evidence of a novel, highly profitable chemical process being developed by the company, which is not directly related to the environmental management system being audited. The auditor is aware that this information, if leaked to competitors, could significantly impact the company's market position. What is the auditor's primary ethical and procedural obligation concerning this proprietary information discovered outside the scope of the environmental audit? Option A. Document the existence of the new chemical process in the audit report as a potential area for future business strategy discussion, without detailing its proprietary nature. Option B. Maintain strict confidentiality of the discovered information and refrain from disclosing it to any third party, including the client commissioning the audit, unless legally compelled to do so. Option C. Share the information with other auditors within the firm to assess its potential environmental implications, even if it falls outside the current audit scope. Option D. Immediately report the discovery of the new chemical process to the client commissioning the audit, as it represents a significant business development that might require further internal review. Correct answer is B. Maintain strict confidentiality of the discovered information and refrain from disclosing it to any third party, including the client commissioning the audit, unless legally compelled to do so. Explanation. The core principle of confidentiality in environmental auditing, as guided by ISO 14011, 1996, necessitates that auditors safeguard sensitive information obtained during the audit process. This includes proprietary operational data, trade secrets, and any other information that could potentially harm the auditee if disclosed inappropriately. Auditors have a professional obligation to prevent unauthorized access to or dissemination of such data. This commitment extends beyond the audit itself, often implying a continuing duty of care. The purpose of this strict adherence to confidentiality is to foster trust between the auditee and the audit team, ensuring that the auditee feels secure in providing full and frank disclosure, which is essential for a thorough and effective audit. Breaches of confidentiality can lead to legal repercussions, damage to the auditor's reputation, and undermine the integrity of the entire auditing process. Therefore, auditors must implement robust internal controls and personal ethical standards to maintain the privacy of all audit-related information. Question 17. A comprehensive environmental audit at a manufacturing facility, adhering to ISO 14011, 1996 guidelines, is examining the company's compliance with the Clean Water Act discharge limits for a specific chemical compound. During the site inspection, the auditor observes that while the facility's wastewater treatment plant is operating, the daily logs for the final effluent analysis show inconsistent data entry, with several days missing the required concentration readings for this compound. Furthermore, the auditor notes that a new experimental chemical is being used in a production process that is not explicitly listed in the facility's environmental aspects register, and its potential discharge pathway into the local watercourse has not been assessed. Considering the audit's objective to identify nonconformances and potential environmental risks, which of the following findings most accurately reflects both a confirmed nonconformance and a significant potential environmental risk that requires immediate attention and reporting? Option A. Incomplete effluent analysis logs indicating a nonconformance with record-keeping requirements, coupled with the unassessed use of a new chemical with an unknown discharge pathway, representing a potential risk of unmonitored and uncontrolled environmental contamination. Option B. The inconsistent data entry in daily effluent analysis logs, which constitutes a nonconformance with the facility's documented procedures for record-keeping, but does not inherently indicate an increased risk of exceeding discharge limits. Option C. Presence of an experimental chemical in production without its inclusion in the environmental aspects register, signifying a potential risk of future noncompliance, but no confirmed nonconformance in current discharge monitoring. Option D. The use of a new chemical in production that is not yet listed in the environmental aspects register, which is a procedural nonconformance, and the incomplete effluent analysis logs, which are a separate record-keeping issue, without direct linkage to immediate environmental risk. Correct answer is A. Incomplete effluent analysis logs indicating a nonconformance with record-keeping requirements, coupled with the unassessed use of a new chemical with an unknown discharge pathway, representing a potential risk of unmonitored and uncontrolled environmental contamination. Explanation. The core principle behind identifying nonconformances and potential environmental risks during an environmental audit, as guided by ISO 14011, 1996, is the systematic evaluation of an organization's environmental management system against established criteria. This process involves comparing observed practices, procedures, and outcomes with the requirements of the environmental policy, objectives, legal and regulatory requirements, and the documented environmental management system itself. A nonconformance is a deviation from these requirements. Potential environmental risks, on the other hand, are conditions or activities that could lead to an environmental impact, even if they do not currently represent a nonconformance. The auditor's role is to gather sufficient and appropriate evidence through interviews, observation of activities, and review of records to identify these deviations and potential hazards. The analysis of this evidence then forms the basis for determining whether a nonconformance exists and if there is a potential for future environmental harm. This involves understanding the context of the organization's operations, its environmental aspects, and the controls in place. For instance, if an audit finds that wastewater discharge monitoring records are incomplete, this is a direct nonconformance with regulatory requirements. However, if the auditor observes a process where chemicals are stored in an open area without secondary containment, even if no spill has occurred, this represents a potential environmental risk that needs to be identified and addressed to prevent future nonconformances and environmental impacts. The auditor must critically assess the effectiveness of existing controls in mitigating identified risks. Question 18. During an environmental audit of a manufacturing facility that processes hazardous waste, the lead auditor discovers that a key environmental compliance manager within the Audit organization is also a close personal friend of the auditor's spouse. This relationship predates the audit engagement, which fundamental principle of environmental auditing, as defined by ISO 14011, 1996, is most likely to be compromised by this situation, potentially impacting the reliability of the audit findings. Option A, competence and integrity. Option B, confidentiality and due professional care. Option C, independence and objectivity. Option D, impartiality and evidence-based reporting. The correct answer is C, independence and objectivity. Explanation. The core principles of environmental auditing, as outlined in ISO 14011, 1996, emphasize objectivity, independence, and due professional care. Independence ensures that the audit findings are free from bias and undue influence, allowing for an impartial assessment of the auditee's environmental management system. Objectivity requires that the audit be based on factual evidence gathered through systematic examination of records, procedures, and practices. Due professional care dictates that auditors must exercise diligence and skill appropriate to their profession, staying abreast of relevant environmental regulations and auditing techniques. Considering a scenario where an auditor has a prior business relationship with a supplier of the audit, this relationship could potentially compromise the auditor's objectivity. If the auditor's findings were to negatively impact this supplier, the auditor might be inclined to soften the findings to avoid damaging their existing business connection. This directly contravenes the principle of independence. Similarly, if the auditor relies on anecdotal evidence or assumptions rather than verifiable documentation and site observations, it would violate the principle of objectivity and due professional care. The principle of confidentiality is also crucial, ensuring that sensitive information obtained during the audit is protected. However, the most direct threat to the integrity of the audit process in this context, where a pre-existing relationship could influence judgment, is the compromise of independence and objectivity. Question 19. During an audit of a manufacturing facility's waste management system, an auditor discovers that several waste manifests for hazardous solvents generated at the facility indicate disposal at a site that is not listed on the organization's approved hazardous waste disposal vendor list, which was last updated 6 months prior to the audit. The organization's environmental manager states that the waste hauling company unilaterally changed the disposal site due to operational issues at the primary facility, without prior notification. What is the most appropriate immediate action for the auditor to take in accordance with ISO 14011-1996 guidelines for audit procedures when reviewing waste manifests and disposal records in this scenario? Option A. Accept the environmental manager's explanation and close the finding, assuming the waste hauling company acted in good faith to ensure proper disposal. Option B. Focus the audit scope solely on the internal waste generation records, as the disposal process is managed by a third-party contractor and is outside the direct control of the audited organization. Option C. Immediately halt all waste shipments from the facility until a formal investigation into the unauthorized disposal site is completed by the environmental regulatory agency. Option D. Document the discrepancy as a potential nonconformity, requiring the organization to provide evidence of corrective actions taken to investigate the unauthorized disposal and ensure future compliance with its approved vendor list and relevant waste disposal regulations. The correct answer is D. Document the discrepancy as a potential nonconformity, requiring the organization to provide evidence of corrective actions taken to investigate the unauthorized disposal and ensure future compliance with its approved vendor list and relevant waste disposal regulations. Explanation: the core of reviewing waste manifests and disposal records in an environmental audit, as guided by ISO 14011-1996, is to verify the accuracy, completeness, and compliance of waste management practices with applicable regulations and the organization's environmental policy. This involves cross-referencing manifest details with internal waste generation records, ensuring proper classification of waste types, e.g., hazardous vs. non-hazardous, and confirming that disposal occurred at authorized facilities. A critical aspect is the audit trail, the ability to trace waste from its point of generation to its final disposition. When discrepancies arise, such as a manifest indicating disposal of a certain waste stream at a facility not listed in the organization's approved vendor list, or a significant volume difference between generation records and disposal manifests, the auditor must investigate further. This investigation might involve requesting additional documentation from the waste transporter or disposal facility, interviewing relevant personnel, and assessing the potential environmental and legal implications of the nonconformity. The auditor's role is to identify potential noncompliance with regulations like the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) in the United States or equivalent national legislation, and to evaluate the effectiveness of the organization's waste management system in preventing pollution and ensuring responsible disposal. The goal is to ensure that the documented disposal methods align with the organization's stated environmental commitments and legal obligations, thereby providing assurance of environmental performance. Question 20. Consider an environmental auditing team tasked with evaluating the effectiveness of the environmental management system, EMS, at a large manufacturing facility that produces specialty chemicals. The facility has a documented policy and has set targets for reducing volatile organic compound, VOC emissions. During the audit, the team observes that while the facility has installed advanced emission control equipment, the frequency of unscheduled downtime for this equipment has increased significantly over the past year, leading to periods where emissions exceed permitted levels, albeit not continuously. The audit team also notes that the corrective actions taken following these downtime events are often reactive, focusing on temporary fixes rather than root cause analysis of the equipment's operational issues. Which of the following observations would most strongly indicate a potential deficiency in the effectiveness of the EMS's operational controls and corrective action processes, as per ISO 14011-1996 guidelines? Option A. The EMS documentation clearly outlines procedures for equipment maintenance, and regular training sessions are conducted for maintenance personnel on general safety protocols. Option B. The organization has invested in a new software system to track environmental incidents, and this system is being piloted in one department before a full rollout. Option C. The facility's internal audit reports consistently identify minor deviations in record-keeping for emission monitoring data, but these are always rectified promptly by administrative staff. Option D. The environmental manager routinely communicates emission performance data to local regulatory bodies, exceeding the minimum reporting requirements stipulated by the Clean Air Act amendments. The correct answer is C. The facility's internal audit reports consistently identify minor deviations in record-keeping for emission monitoring data, but these are always rectified promptly by administrative staff. Explanation: the effectiveness of an environmental management system, EMS, is evaluated through various audit processes, as outlined in ISO 14011-1996. Critical aspect of this evaluation involves assessing whether the established environmental policies, objectives, and targets are being met, and if the system's controls are functioning as intended to prevent or mitigate environmental impacts. This requires the auditor to go beyond mere compliance checks and delve into the operational aspects of the EMS. Specifically, the auditor must examine the procedures for identifying significant environmental aspects, setting appropriate objectives and targets, implementing operational controls, and monitoring performance. The ability of the organization to demonstrate that its corrective and preventive actions are effectively addressing identified nonconformities and potential nonconformities is a key indicator of EMS effectiveness. Furthermore, the auditor will review the management review process to ensure it adequately assesses the EMS's suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness, leading to informed decisions for continual improvement. The integration of environmental considerations into business processes and the commitment of top management are also crucial elements that contribute to the overall effectiveness of the EMS. The ultimate goal is to determine if the EMS is achieving its intended environmental outcomes and contributing to the organization's environmental policy. Question 21. When conducting an environmental audit according to ISO 14011-1996 guidelines, a critical preliminary step involves establishing the complete set of environmental, legal, and regulatory requirements applicable to the auditee's operations. Consider an auditing team tasked with evaluating a multinational chemical manufacturing company that has facilities in Germany, Brazil, and India. The team must also account for international agreements and conventions that might influence the company's environmental performance, such as the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and their Disposal. Which of the following approaches best encapsulates the comprehensive methodology for identifying all relevant environmental, legal, and regulatory requirements for such an audit? Option A. Consulting a general international environmental law compendium and cross-referencing it with the auditee's most recent annual report, with a focus on general sustainability claims rather than specific legal obligations. Option B. Systematically identifying and reviewing national legislation in Germany, Brazil, and India, relevant international agreements like the Basel Convention, and any specific local ordinances or permits applicable to each facility's location and operational activities. Option C. Relying solely on the auditee's internal compliance register and recent environmental impact assessments conducted for their German facilities, assuming consistency across all global operations. Option D. Prioritizing the review of European Union directives that might indirectly affect the company due to its global trade activities, while disregarding specific national laws of Brazil and India, unless explicitly mentioned by the Audit. The correct answer is C. Relying solely on the Audit's internal compliance register and recent environmental impact assessments conducted for their German facilities, assuming consistency across all global operations. Explanation: the process of identifying applicable environmental laws and regulations for an audit, as outlined in ISO 14011, 1996, involves a systematic approach to ensure all relevant legal and regulatory requirements are considered. This begins with understanding the scope of the audit and the activities, products, and services of the Audit. A key step is to determine the jurisdiction in which the Audit operates, as environmental legislation varies significantly by region, nation, and even local authority. The auditor must then consult a comprehensive and up-to-date database or compilation of environmental laws, regulations, permits, and other requirements. This can involve accessing government websites, subscribing to legal update services, or consulting with legal experts specializing in environmental law. The identification process should also consider any voluntary commitments the organization has made, such as industry codes of practice or corporate policies, as these may also be subject to audit. Furthermore, the auditor must ascertain the specific applicability of these identified requirements to the Audit's operations. This involves understanding how the Audit's activities, emissions, discharges, and waste management practices align with the provisions of the relevant legislation. For instance, if an organization operates a manufacturing facility, the auditor would need to identify regulations pertaining to air emissions, wastewater discharge, hazardous waste management, and chemical storage relevant to that specific type of industry and location. The auditor should also consider the potential for future regulatory changes that might impact the Audit's compliance status. The final output of this phase is a clear understanding of the legal and regulatory framework against which the Audit's environmental management system will be audited. Question 22. Consider a scenario where a facility manufactures specialized coatings and has a process that generates volatile organic compounds, VOC. The facility operates under a National Environmental Protection Act that mandates strict emission limits for VOCs to prevent ground-level ozone formation. During an environmental audit, the auditor needs to assess the significance of the VOC emissions. Which of the following approaches most accurately reflects the process of evaluating the likelihood and severity of the environmental impact of these VOC emissions, according to ISO 14011, 1996 guidelines? Option A. Focusing solely on the volume of VOCs released, assuming that any release above a de minimis threshold automatically constitutes a significant environmental impact regardless of the specific VOC composition or local atmospheric conditions. Option B. Assessing the probability of exceeding the regulatory VOC emission limits based on historical monitoring data and process variability, and evaluating the potential impact on ambient air quality and human health in the surrounding community. Option C. Primarily investigating the cost of implementing advanced VOC abatement technologies, assuming that the severity of the impact is directly proportional to the cost of mitigation rather than the actual environmental consequence. Option D. Quantifying the total annual VOC emissions in kilograms and comparing this figure directly to the National Emission Inventory without considering the effectiveness of emission control technologies. The correct answer is B. Assessing the probability of exceeding the regulatory VOC emission limits based on historical monitoring data and process variability, and evaluating the potential impact on ambient air quality and human health in the surrounding community. Explanation: the core principle of evaluating the likelihood and severity of environmental impacts, as outlined in ISO 14011, 1996, involves a systematic approach to determine the potential consequences of an organization's activities, products, or services on the environment. This evaluation is crucial for identifying significant environmental aspects. Likelihood refers to the probability or frequency of an impact occurring, considering factors such as the scale of the activity, the duration of exposure, and the effectiveness of existing controls. Severity, on the other hand, assesses the magnitude or seriousness of the potential environmental consequence, taking into account the sensitivity of the affected environmental receptors. the extent of the damage, and the potential for irreversible effects. When assessing a scenario involving a chemical manufacturing plant that routinely discharges treated wastewater containing trace levels of heavy metals into a river, an auditor would consider the likelihood of exceeding regulatory discharge limits, e.g., under the Clean Water Act or equivalent national legislation, and the potential severity of such an exceedance on the aquatic ecosystem and downstream water users. A low likelihood might be due to robust treatment processes and regular monitoring, while a high severity could arise if the heavy metals are highly toxic to aquatic life, or if the river is a primary source of drinking water. The evaluation aims to prioritize aspects that have the greatest potential to cause significant harm, thereby guiding the focus of the audit and the development of environmental management system improvements. The process does not involve complex calculations, but rather a qualitative or semi-quantitative assessment based on available data, expert judgment, and regulatory requirements. Question 23. An environmental management system audit program manager is reviewing the qualifications of potential auditors for a complex audit of a multinational chemical manufacturing company. The company operates under stringent national environmental regulations, including the Clean Air Act and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) in the United States, and similar directives in its European facilities. The audit's objective is to assess the integration of the company's environmental management system into its day-to-day business operations and its compliance with these diverse regulatory frameworks. Which of the following responsibilities is most critical for the audit program manager to fulfill to ensure the audit's success and adherence to ISO 14011-1996 guidelines? Option A. Providing extensive training to the auditee's personnel on environmental management principles prior to the audit to improve their understanding. Option B. Negotiating the audit schedule with the auditee to minimize operational disruptions, prioritizing convenience over thoroughness. Option C. Ensuring the competence of the auditors selected for the audit, considering their knowledge of relevant environmental regulations and industry-specific practices. Option D. Developing a detailed audit checklist that covers every conceivable environmental aspect, regardless of the company's specific operational risks. Correct answer is C. Ensuring the competence of the auditors selected for the audit, considering their knowledge of relevant environmental regulations and industry-specific practices. Explanation: ISO 14011-1996, in its guidelines for environmental auditing, emphasizes the importance of an audit program structure and management. Specifically, it outlines the responsibilities of the audit program manager, which include ensuring that auditors are competent and that the audit process itself is effective. Clause 4.2 details the responsibilities of the audit program manager, stating that they should ensure the competence of auditors and the effective management of the audit program. This involves selecting appropriate auditors for specific audits based on their qualifications and experience, and ensuring that the overall audit process, from planning to reporting, adheres to the established procedures and standards. Management of the audit program encompasses resource allocation, scheduling, and oversight to ensure that the audits contribute to the improvement of the auditee's environmental management system. Therefore, the primary responsibility of the audit program manager is to oversee the entire audit process, ensuring its integrity and effectiveness, which includes the crucial aspect of auditor competence and the proper execution of audit procedures as defined by the standard. Question 24. Following an environmental audit that revealed a potential violation of local wastewater discharge limits for suspended solids, a critical follow-up action is to verify the effectiveness of the implemented corrective measures. The audit report cited a specific clause within the National Environmental Protection Act that defines the permissible suspended solids concentration. Which of the following best describes the primary objective of the verification phase in this context, according to the principles of ISO 14011-1996? Option A. To ensure that all audit findings, regardless of their severity or relation to regulatory compliance, have been documented and closed out by the auditee. Option B. To gather additional evidence of the nonconformity to support potential legal action against the organization for environmental damage. Option C. To assess the cost-effectiveness of the corrective actions taken and recommend alternative, less expensive solutions if necessary. Option D. To confirm that the corrective actions implemented are demonstrably preventing recurrence of the identified nonconformity and are achieving compliance with the cited environmental regulation. Correct answer is D. To confirm that the corrective actions implemented are demonstrably preventing recurrence of the identified nonconformity and are achieving compliance with the cited environmental regulation. Explanation: the core principle of follow-up and verification after an environmental audit, as outlined in ISO 14011-1996, is to ensure that identified nonconformities have been addressed effectively. This involves not just implementing corrective actions, but also confirming their continued effectiveness in preventing recurrence and achieving compliance with environmental legislation and the organization's own environmental policy. When an audit report identifies a potential breach of local wastewater discharge regulations, such as exceeding the permissible limit for suspended solids as stipulated by the Clean Water Act, the audit team's follow-up responsibilities are crucial. Verification process should ascertain that the corrective actions taken, for instance, the installation of a new filtration system, are not only in place, but are also functioning as intended and are consistently meeting the regulatory parameters. This might involve reviewing updated monitoring data, conducting a site visit to observe the new system's operation, and potentially performing a mini-audit or specific tests to confirm the effectiveness of the implemented solutions. The ultimate goal is to provide assurance that the environmental management system is capable of maintaining compliance and achieving its environmental objectives, thereby reducing the risk of future noncompliance and associated penalties. Question 25. When assessing the significance of an audit finding related to an organization's environmental management system, which of the following approaches best reflects the principles outlined in ISO 14011-1996 for determining the weight and priority of corrective actions? Option A. Evaluating the finding against the organization's environmental policy, objectives, and the potential for recurrence or systemic impact, considering relevant regulatory requirements such as those under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, (RCRA), for waste management. Option B. Focusing exclusively on the number of individuals involved in the non-conforming activity, irrespective of the environmental consequence or the potential for future occurrences. Option C. Prioritizing findings solely based on the direct cost of immediate noncompliance penalties as determined by local environmental ordinances. Option D. Assigning significance based on the audit team's personal opinion of the severity of the environmental impact, without cross-referencing against established organizational procedures or regulatory frameworks. The correct answer is A. Evaluating the finding against the organization's environmental policy, objectives, and the potential for recurrence or systemic impact, considering relevant regulatory requirements such as those under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) for waste management. Explanation: ISO 14011-1996, specifically in its guidance on audit procedures, emphasizes the systematic evaluation of audit findings to determine their significance. Significance is not merely about the direct nonconformity, but also its potential implications. This involves considering the likelihood of recurrence, the magnitude of the environmental impact, the potential for regulatory contravention, e.g., exceeding permitted discharge limits under the Clean Water Act or violating air quality standards under the Clean Air Act, and the overall effect on the organization's environmental management system's ability to achieve its objectives. A finding's significance is assessed by the audit team in relation to the established audit criteria and the organization's environmental policy and objectives. It requires professional judgment to weigh the evidence gathered against these criteria. Factors like the frequency of the noncompliance, the potential for environmental harm, and the systemic nature of the issue are crucial. For instance, a single, minor deviation from a record-keeping procedure might be less significant than repeated instances of failing to monitor emissions, even if the latter has not yet resulted in a regulatory fine. The assessment guides the formulation of audit conclusions and recommendations, prioritizing areas requiring corrective action. Question 26. An environmental auditor is examining the waste disposal records of a manufacturing facility that produces hazardous chemicals. The facility has historically relied on an external contractor for off-site disposal. During the audit, the auditor discovers that the contractor's disposal manifests do not consistently align with the facility's internal waste characterization reports, and there is evidence suggesting some waste streams may have been improperly handled at the contractor's facility, potentially violating regulations like RCRA. Based on the principles of environmental auditing as per ISO 14011, 1996, what is the auditor's primary role in relation to the facility's potential environmental liability in this scenario? Option A. To definitively determine the extent of the contractor's legal culpability for any improper waste disposal activities. Option B. To immediately cease the audit and report the findings directly to the relevant environmental regulatory agency for enforcement action. Option C. To provide a legal opinion on the specific statutes and clauses that the facility has violated based on the discovered discrepancies. Option D. To identify and document conditions and practices that indicate potential noncompliance with environmental laws and regulations, thereby highlighting areas of potential liability. The correct answer is D. To identify and document conditions and practices that indicate potential noncompliance with environmental laws and regulations, thereby highlighting areas of potential liability. Explanation. The core principle of environmental auditing, as outlined in ISO 14011, 1996, is to provide an objective assessment of an organization's environmental performance. And considering environmental liability, an audit's role is not to determine legal guilt or innocence, which is the purview of legal proceedings, but rather to identify potential risks and nonconformities that could lead to future liabilities. This includes verifying compliance with applicable environmental laws and regulations, assessing the effectiveness of environmental management systems in preventing pollution and managing waste, and evaluating the adequacy of controls to mitigate environmental impacts. The audit process aims to uncover evidence of practices that might contravene regulations such as the Clean Water Act or the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) in the United States, or similar national legislation, which could result in fines, penalties, or remediation costs. Therefore, an environmental audit's primary contribution to understanding environmental liability is through the identification and documentation of conditions and practices that represent potential legal or financial exposure. It provides factual findings that can inform risk assessments and strategic decisions regarding environmental compliance and management, rather than making definitive legal pronouncements. Question 27. During an environmental audit at a manufacturing facility, an auditor discovers that the company's internal documentation for managing spent solvents categorizes them under a general hazardous waste code. However, a review of the National Environmental Protection Act reveals a specific subclassification for volatile organic compounds, VOC, with stringent requirements for storage, containment, and disposal, which are not fully reflected in the company's current practices. Which of the following represents the most appropriate initial action for the auditor to take in accordance with ISO 14011, 1996 guidelines for audit procedures? Option A. Document the observed deviation as a nonconformity and discuss its implications with the auditee, initiating a process for corrective action planning. Option B. Conclude that the company's waste management system is inadequate and recommend a complete overhaul of its environmental management system without further investigation into specific deviations. Option C. Immediately issue a formal citation to the company, referencing the specific clauses of the National Environmental Protection Act that have been violated. Option D. Recommend the immediate cessation of all activities involving spent solvents until the company revises its entire waste management protocol. The correct answer is A. Document the observed deviation as a nonconformity and discuss its implications with the auditee, initiating a process for corrective action planning. Explanation. The core principle of auditing environmental compliance, as outlined in ISO 14011, 1996, involves a systematic process of evaluating whether an organization's environmental management system and its actual practices conform to applicable legal requirements and other standards to which the organization subscribes. When an auditor identifies a discrepancy between a company's documented procedures for managing hazardous waste and the specific requirements of the National Environmental Protection Act concerning the segregation and labeling of Class B chemical waste, the auditor's primary responsibility is to determine the extent of nonconformity. This involves verifying if the company's practices deviate from the legal mandate, and if so, assessing the potential environmental impact and the root cause of the deviation. The auditor must then document this finding, classifying it based on its severity and potential consequences. The subsequent steps would involve discussing the finding with the auditee and recommending corrective actions to bring the company's practices into alignment with the regulation. The objective is not to immediately impose penalties, which is the role of regulatory bodies, but to facilitate the improvement of the environmental management system and ensure future compliance. Therefore, the most appropriate immediate action is to document the nonconformity and initiate discussions for corrective actions. Question 28. Consider a multinational corporation, Terra Corp, that is in the process of acquiring a manufacturing plant previously operated by Old Guard Industries. Terra Corp's legal and environmental teams require a comprehensive understanding of any pre-existing environmental contamination, potential noncompliance with statutes like the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act (CERCLA) and its state-level counterparts, and any outstanding environmental permits or obligations at the target facility before finalizing the purchase agreement. Which type of environmental audit, as guided by principles similar to ISO 14011-1996, would be most appropriate for Terra Corp to undertake in this specific context? Option A. Environmental Performance Audit. Option B. Environmental Due Diligence Audit. Option C. Environmental Management System Audit. Option D. Environmental Compliance Audit. The correct answer is B. Environmental Due Diligence Audit. Explanation. The scenario describes a situation where an organization is acquiring a new facility. The primary objective is to understand the potential environmental liabilities and risks associated with this acquisition, particularly concerning historical contamination and compliance with current environmental regulations, such as the Clean Water Act and Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA). An environmental audit focused on assessing the property's condition and identifying existing or potential environmental problems before the transaction is completed is crucial. This type of audit, which aims to determine the environmental status of a property and any associated legal responsibilities, is specifically categorized as a due diligence audit. It is distinct from a compliance audit, which primarily verifies adherence to specific legal requirements at a given time, or a management system audit, which evaluates the effectiveness of an organization's environmental management system, EMS, like ISO 14001. The due diligence audit provides the necessary information for informed decision-making regarding the acquisition, including potential remediation costs and negotiation of purchase terms. Question 29. Consider an environmental audit at a manufacturing facility that produces industrial solvents. The facility has identified the potential for accidental spills of volatile organic compounds, VOC, into the local watershed as a significant environmental aspect. The documented risk control measure is a secondary containment system around storage tanks and a regular inspection schedule for tank integrity. During the audit, it is observed that while the secondary containment structures are present, the inspection logs are incomplete, and there are visible signs of corrosion on one of the primary storage tanks. Furthermore, recent effluent monitoring data, mandated by the Regional Environmental Protection Agency, indicates trace levels of VOCs in the facility's treated wastewater discharge, although still within the current regulatory limits. Which of the following most accurately reflects the assessment of the effectiveness of the risk management controls for VOC spills? Option A. The risk management controls are highly effective because the effluent monitoring data confirms that VOC levels remain within the legally permissible discharge limits set by the Regional Environmental Protection Agency. Option B. The risk management controls are likely ineffective due to the incomplete inspection records and visible signs of tank degradation, suggesting a potential breakdown in control implementation and maintenance, despite the absence of documented exceedances in effluent monitoring. Option C. The risk management controls are deemed effective because the primary risk of a catastrophic spill has been addressed by the secondary containment, and the audit's focus should be on compliance with discharge permits rather than proactive risk mitigation. Option D. The risk management controls are considered partially effective as the secondary containment is in place, and the trace VOCs in the effluent are below regulatory thresholds, indicating a low immediate risk. The correct answer is B. The risk management controls are likely ineffective due to the incomplete inspection records and visible signs of tank degradation, suggesting a potential breakdown in control implementation and maintenance, despite the absence of documented exceedances in effluent monitoring. Explanation: the effectiveness of risk management controls within an environmental auditing framework, as guided by ISO 14011-1996, is assessed by evaluating the degree to which identified environmental risks are being mitigated or controlled to acceptable levels. This involves examining the documented procedures for risk assessment and control, verifying their implementation through evidence collection, and then determining if the residual risk is within the organization's defined tolerance. A key aspect is not just the existence of controls, but their demonstrable impact on reducing the likelihood or consequence of environmental aspects. For instance, if a significant environmental aspect is the potential for uncontrolled discharge of wastewater, an effective control might be a functioning wastewater treatment system with regular maintenance and monitoring. The audit would look for evidence of this system's operation, maintenance logs, and effluent monitoring data that shows compliance with regulatory limits, such as those set by the Clean Water Act or equivalent local legislation. If the monitoring data consistently shows discharges exceeding permitted levels, the control is deemed ineffective, irrespective of its documented existence. Therefore, the assessment hinges on the objective evidence of control performance against established criteria, which are often derived from legal requirements, organizational policies, and the initial risk assessment. The audit's conclusion on control effectiveness directly informs the overall assessment of the environmental management system's ability to achieve its environmental objectives and comply with relevant environmental legislation. Question 30. Consider an environmental audit of a manufacturing facility that produces specialized industrial coatings. The facility is subject to stringent air emission regulations under the Regional Environmental Protection Act, which mandates specific monitoring frequencies and reporting thresholds for volatile organic compounds, VOC. During the audit, it is discovered that for 3 consecutive months, the facility's internal record-keeping for VOC emissions monitoring showed a data entry error, resulting in a slight underreporting of the average daily concentration. However, subsequent reanalysis of the raw sensor data, performed by the audit team, indicates that the actual average daily VOC concentrations remained consistently below the regulatory limit, albeit closer to it than initially recorded. Given these circumstances, how should an auditor, following ISO 14011-1996 guidelines, primarily assess the materiality of this data discrepancy for the audit's scope and focus? Option A. Evaluate the discrepancy based on the potential for it to mislead stakeholders regarding the facility's compliance status and the adequacy of its monitoring and reporting controls, even if actual emissions were within limits. Option B. Dismiss the discrepancy entirely as immaterial because the actual emissions remained below the legal threshold, indicating no immediate regulatory violation. Option C. Focus the audit solely on the technical accuracy of the sensor equipment, assuming the data entry error is an isolated administrative issue unrelated to the environmental management system's effectiveness. Option D. Expand the audit scope to include a comprehensive review of all historical environmental data for the past 5 years, regardless of the current discrepancy's specific nature or impact. The correct answer is A. Evaluate the discrepancy based on the potential for it to mislead stakeholders regarding the facility's compliance status and the adequacy of its monitoring and reporting controls, even if actual emissions were within limits. Explanation: ISO 14011-1996, specifically in its guidance on audit procedures, emphasizes a risk-based approach to environmental auditing. This involves identifying potential environmental aspects and impacts that could lead to nonconformities with environmental legislation or the organization's environmental management system. Materiality, in this context, refers to the significance of these potential issues. An auditor must assess whether an identified issue, if it were to occur or if a nonconformity exists, would be substantial enough to affect the credibility of the environmental management system, mislead stakeholders, or result in significant environmental harm or legal penalties. This assessment guides the auditor in determining the scope, focus, and depth of the audit. For instance, a minor deviation in a waste segregation procedure might be considered immaterial if it has no significant environmental consequence and is unlikely to lead to legal breaches. Conversely, a consistent failure to monitor emissions from a major industrial process, even if no exceedance has yet been reported, would be highly material due to the potential for significant environmental damage and regulatory fines under frameworks like the Clean Air Act or equivalent national legislation. The auditor's judgment on materiality is crucial for efficiently allocating audit resources and ensuring that the audit effectively addresses the most significant environmental risks and potential nonconformities. This involves considering the likelihood of occurrence and the potential magnitude of the consequence, both environmentally and financially.